Good afternoon, or evening. I'm not sure which way you like to say it here. We've been in McClenny for 17 years, and they start saying good evening at 1 o'clock. So it's local custom. Interestingly enough, when we lived in Italy, there was the same difference between Rome and Milan. In Rome, they don't say buonasera until after dinner, and in Milan they say buonasera in the afternoon. So it's always something. Welcome, and we were asked to do more than specifically address the death penalty. We were asked to also share a bit about what we do, to kind of put a context on it. So my name is Dale Recinella, and this is my wife Susan, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, sometimes you're someone's mother and sometimes you're someone's husband. I'm Susan Recinella. I'm working at the FSU Counseling Center. I've been there the last 4 years. I'm the Director of Intern Training. And before that, especially when we were over in McClenny, I was the Director of Intern Training at Northeast Florida State Hospital. So I've actually worked with severe mental illness about 20 years, and that's also dear to my heart, as well as the college students who I've definitely fallen in love with.
And I've served as a Catholic chaplain at Florida's death row for 17 years, until the last year, including cell front ministry, cell to cell. And in the last year, as I now get ready to file my Medicare elections, have turned that over to a transition team that we trained that is headed by a Deacon Jason Roy from the St. Augustine Diocese. But I still handle one-on-one pastoral counseling with men on death row, and still am available at the request of the inmate for Death Watch, which is spiritual counseling in the death house at their cell. When their warrant has been signed and they've been moved from their death row cell to the death house, usually for 5 or 6 weeks until they're killed by the state. And believe it or not, over these holidays, we have 2 men in Florida's death house. One is Oscar Bolin, who Susan and I sponsored for confirmation in 2005. And the other is Michael Lambrix, who Susan and I sponsored for confirmation in 2004. So our relationship with them as spiritual mentors goes back quite a few years. I've known each of them for 17 years. And both of them asked me to serve as their Death Watch counselor. So I am in the death house with them, and if their execution goes forward, I will be there for them when they are executed. And Susan has made arrangements to be available for the family, which is what she has done the time we lived in Tallahassee in McClenny. Susan took care of the family of the condemned during the execution. They're not allowed to be on the property or at the prison or anything during the execution. And so Susan made it her volunteer ministry to be there at the church, available for the mother, the children, the brothers and sisters, the family of the person being killed by the state. How did we get into this? I'm looking, I see Peter and Brian and Jim. We've got 4 guys here from Chirp Team number 1, 1988, February. For those of you who weren't on Chirp 1 in February of 1988, my first career was as a lawyer in Wall Street finance out of Florida. And the reason we moved to Tallahassee from Miami is that I had started representing the state of Florida as a client and got tired of commuting back and forth on single-engine props. And we moved here and built our dream home in High Grove, Phase 1. It's important to say Phase 1, right? Then everybody knows. And that was great. And we had 4 children when we came here, and our 5th child was born here in Tallahassee. And that's Addie, who's right here, and has blessed us with our 7th grandchild, and her husband Andrew are members of the parish, and a lot of you know Jeanette and Dave, who are members of the parish, and Jeanette is our middle daughter. So we have been around quite a bit since 1986 when we first moved to Tallahassee. And in the course of the years after we got here, not incidentally after a severe illness with flesh-eating bacteria that I internalized from a bad oyster, and had what's called a near-death experience at TMH, people ask me, oh, near-death experience, did you get the lights and the music? And I tell them, no, I got the lecture. And the lecture basically was, after kissing Susan goodbye, which was after Father Foley gave me last rites, and I had no chance of surviving the night. I was done. Everything had already started shutting down. They said I was finished. I would not see the next morning. I had an experience of standing before Christ, and he questioned me on what I was doing with his gifts. I'd always thought of them as my gifts and my talents and my abilities, but he was quite clear they were his gifts, and he wanted me to account for how I had been using them. And I had been using them to do a lot of great deals: football stadiums, seaports, airports, telecommunication systems. I loved what I did, and it was all good stuff. But what he was getting at is that for me, my career and the money that it generated and the things that money could buy were replacing what God should have been filling in my life. There was a hole in me, a God-sized hole, and I was filling it with the recognition that came from the deals and the satisfaction that came from making the money, and it really should have been filled by God. And so his last challenge to me in that experience was, what about my people who are suffering? And I had argued on all the other questions. I mean, I went to a national law school, Notre Dame. I know how to argue. That one I had no argument. And I just looked at him and I said, I promise you, and I did point, I promise you, give me another chance and I'll do it different. And that was it. The experience was over. Susan tells me it was about 6:45 in the morning when I opened my eyes. She'd been sitting next to my bed all night waiting for me to be officially dead. And I looked at her and I said, I'm not dead, am I? And my parents are both from Italy. If you know me at all, you would have guessed it even if I didn't tell you. Susan is from an English-Irish background, and it's very sweet and soft and understated. And she looked at me with that Irish humor and said, obviously you're not dead. You're still talking. And I was released from the hospital. The bacteria was gone. Vibrio vulnificans. It was gone. And I was released from the hospital. I was not in very good shape, those of you that knew me then, because I had been on chirp right before this happened. It took about a year before I could even walk normal. It really did a mess on my body. But I was alive. And we started on a little bit of a journey with 5 kids. Addie was a year old. What did I promise to do? What does it mean to make the highest priority, other than worship of God, taking care of God's suffering people? And that might be a question you answer a certain way if you're single, if you're a single man or a single woman in your 20s and you're looking at the possibility of a religious vocation. But we were sitting here with 5 kids aged 1 to 14, and the whole different question. And so we got tremendous wisdom from Father Foley, who has always kept a really good sense of humor with us. and a Franciscan spiritual advisor, Murray Bodo, who had been my spiritual advisor in high school seminary in Cincinnati.
I think one of the things that's also been interesting is, you know, sometimes you say, well, I hope God knows what he's doing, right? And then you move over so lightning doesn't strike, right? He always seems to know, and we're wondering, why are we doing this? You know, what is going on? Why are we doing this step? And one of the things is, it was powerful ministry at the time, and working with the AIDS, and there were many people dying. And we learned a great deal about grief and death and compassion. But we really didn't realize back then that this working, where Dale was working with a man, usually it was always a man, I think, that was dying of AIDS, and I was dealing with comforting the families. I mean, we never would have dreamed that now we're doing the same thing. We're doing it in a very different place, a very different way. But all those years of dealing with grief and death and caretaking of the families, it led us to having, I think, some of the skills that we needed when this phase came.
We always were really trying to stay close to the church and the things we were doing. And we always heard the tradition and the teaching of the church. In doing this, we're calling us to do it from the standpoint of the church's teaching about social justice, which is rooted in the Eucharist. It's rooted in that incredible thing that Pope John Paul II named Eucharistic amazement, that God would enter into relationship with us. And that because he loved us first, then we could turn and love others. And the entire social justice understanding of the church flows from the Eucharist, and passing on, if you will, passing on to those that are in our path what God has done for us, because we were enemies and he called us friends. He loved us first, and it was his love that allowed us to be able to love back. This is the model of reaching out in relationship in ministry in a way that comports with the social justice of the church. Solidarity. God became in solidarity with us by taking on everything we deal with other than sin itself. And it's that solidarity that's embodied in the Eucharist that we are being asked to go then and take that to those around us who are suffering, or who are in prison, who are sick. Now, we were doing some things that we thought, well, you know, AIDS ministry, and that led also to cancer ministry. We were doing a lot of work as a couple in death and dying ministry with people dying of cancer and AIDS. But there was one place I was never going to go, and God could not ask me to go, and that was prison. And I got a call from a Baptist chaplain at Appalachia Correctional Institution in Sneads, Florida, whose son had been one of my clients in my law practice. And he told me, Brother Dale, my son has told me what you're doing on the streets in Frenchtown. And I've got a 2,000-man prison, mostly lifers. And I've got a lot of men that are HIV positive, and I've got men going into end stage of AIDS, and nobody will come in and minister to them because they're scared. This pastor was originally from southern Alabama, so he said, they're scared. He said, but you're not scared. Well, you come to my prison and do what you're doing in Frenchtown. And I did the Christian punt. Oh, Pastor, I am just so incredibly humbled that you would think that I'm able to do this. I will put it in front of the Lord and pray about it. And I got off the phone and I turned to Susan and I said, there is no way God would ever ask me to go to prison. I had financed prisons all over the country, but I'd never been in one. And I came home a few days later, and my family was sitting around the dining room table. We had a thing we did in our family called family meetings, and anybody could call one. And we had all promised each other, if somebody called a family meeting, we would be there, we would listen, and we would give credence to whatever their concern was. And Susan and the kids are all sitting around the table, and they've all got their Bibles open, and they're all open to Matthew 25. So, I mean, I did a lot of work up on the hill. I figured some caucusing had taken place. And I said, "What's up?" And it was Christina, our daughter who was in 9th grade at Leon. And she said, "Dad, you're the one who's always telling us Jesus meant what he said. Well, listen to what he said." In Matthew 25, in Jesus' description of the Last Judgment, "When you visited the least of my brothers in prison, you visited me." And Jeanette says, "Yeah. And listen to what he said if you don't." And he said, "When you didn't visit the least of my brothers in prison, you didn't visit me." And then Chris, who was never going to be shown up by his older sisters, said, "Yeah, and listen to what happens if you don't do it." And of course, Jesus said, "Go off to the eternal fire prepared for you from the beginning of the world." And I'm pretty sure it was Daddy said, "That doesn't sound too good, Dad." Well, the family meeting ended in a vote, and it was 5 in favor of me going to prison with 1 abstention, mine. I knew enough to appeal to a higher court. Father Foley just laughed. And I went to prison. And that's how I got into prison ministry. Now, people, when we speak around the country and even overseas, I will frequently get confronted. "Death row! How could you do this to your children?" And I say, "You don't understand. I didn't do this to my children. My children did this to me." But we had no idea it was going to lead to death row. And in 1998, when we were asked if we would make a long-term commitment to handle this ministry on behalf of the church at Florida's death row in Stark and Rayford, we realized that without knowing it, we had been preparing for this for almost a decade and a half. One of the other things that we had done before coming to death row was we had ministered to the families of murder victims. And one of the most shocking awarenesses that came to us in this new ministry, where I would be at the execution with the man, and Susan would be with the family at the church, was in seeing something about both these different ministries.
One of the reasons that we do really love to speak is because we've just kind of gotten this opportunity to meet a lot of amazing people. And through the years, I realized that most of what I've learned, I've learned a lot in school. That was wonderful. But really, now as I get older, I look back, I think some of the most important things I've learned have got to do with my experiences, meeting people through those experiences. And some of the people we've met through this ministry, these were opportunities and experiences that I learned something that I don't think I could have ever learned in a book. And the very first time a man had asked Dale, "Would you be my spiritual advisor if my death warrant is signed?" When that death warrant was signed, he started ministering to the man when he got moved to the death house. And all of a sudden, the man describes that he has this huge Catholic family that is going to be arriving the week before the execution to come say goodbye to him. And, neither of us had really thought about these families. I don't know, hadn't even thought about the men having a family. And all of a sudden, this huge Catholic family was coming. And when that week came, we were going to meet them at the church in our little town. So there's the priest and Dale, and this family had heard for years and years about Brother Dale, And I came along too, because at that point, we were going to try to see, what I could do to help a family. And when this family came, there was a mother who was clearly the matriarch of the family. She was probably early 70s at that point. And several of her children, there was a brother-in-law that came along. They had come from over 1,000 miles away. And it was very clear that during this week, the only thing that was going to get this mother and those children through, the brothers and sisters, through this week and through that last day, was going to be their Catholic faith. They had a strong, strong Catholic faith. And so I said to them, would you like to be in church at the time of the execution? Since they had to say goodbye to their son and their brother at noon, and the execution would be at 6, I asked them if they'd like to be in church. And the mother said, oh my goodness, I can't think of anywhere I would rather be. And the priest said, I will be glad to make the church available to you to be with them. And at the end of that week, I was going to meet this family at 5:30 at the church because the execution was going to be at 6. And when I got there a little early because I wanted to just kind of prepare the church that it would really feel like that sacred place that it is. I turned the lights down. I made sure there weren't any distractions. I lit the candles, so it was very beautiful. And then when the family arrived about 5:30, I could see that they were already very, very upset. So what I did was I walked with them up the middle aisle and let them sit in the front pew right up at the front of the church. And I let them kind of tell they just wanted to be together. So I walked to the back of the church and I just kneeled and I prayed. But then about 10 to 6, they got very quiet because they knew it was getting close. And I was sitting there praying in that quiet. And all of a sudden I realized I had forgotten something. I had forgotten that in our little Catholic church, right across the street, was a Protestant church. And on the hour, chimes rang. So right at 6 o'clock, the chimes started ringing. And we all knew that that was the moment that their son was being killed, that their brother was dying. And everybody was really quiet for about 10 minutes because everybody knew it would take the man about 10 minutes to die. But then I came up to be with them. And there was only one thing this family wanted. They wanted to talk to Dale. They knew he would come directly from the execution straight to the church to talk to them. So it was a very long 20, 30 minutes. But Dale arrived. And he was there to answer all their questions. And that was the very first of many families, but they had lots of questions. They wanted to know, what did he choose for his last meal? The mother wanted to know, did he suffer? His brothers, I remember they asked, was he strong? And it was interesting, with the first family, they asked a question that we found that all the other families that we've been with have asked. They asked, did he mention me? What does a man talk about in the last few hours of his life? And they wanted to know, did he mention me? So, Dale answered all these questions, but then, what do you do? And this was the first family that we'd ever been with. We had felt very strongly connected to this family, I think because of their strong traditional Catholic faith. So for this particular family, we usually share a meal, kind of like you would after a funeral or something. But this family, we asked to share this meal with us back at our home. So we all came back to the house and we were sitting around the table. And it was kind of like probably a funeral, and many funerals maybe that you've been to, where you come back to the house and everybody's talking about, when the person who passed away. The mom was talking about stories when he was a little boy, and the brothers were talking about what they used to do when they were kids, and a lot of tears, a lot of stories. And that was one of those really important moments that Dale had been talking about where we learned something. I was sitting there kind of watching, we'd finished the meal, and I was watching this mother's pain. I was watching her grief. And I said to myself, I have seen this grief before. When I had been sitting with another mother in her living room when she had just had a son murdered earlier that day in a parking lot. And we had been sitting there praying with this mother, and I said, I have seen this grief before. And I realized that both of these mothers had seen their son that morning. They hugged him, and he was fine, and he was healthy. And now he was dead, and he was dead because he'd been killed by a human being, another human being, and he'd been killed on purpose. And I guess I was surprised that there was such a similarity between the pain and the grief of these two mothers. And those are one of many, insights that I've learned that I just wouldn't have dreamed of before actually walking through this path with some of these families.
Susan and I have both been extremely pro-life our entire life. As a college student, I was trained by Dr. Wilkie in Cincinnati to speak at colleges and high schools on abortion and on the evil of abortion. If any of you were at the national conference at McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota, it was actually before the National Right to Life was formed. It was all the local groups coming together to discuss pulling together into a national organization and how to structure it. At the plenary session on Sunday morning of that conference, 5 college students were asked to come up on the stage and address the gathering. I had been picked by the other 4 as the spokesperson. At that time, I didn't know I was going to go to law school. I guess they did. I was the skinny guy on the end. And we asked for the first grant from the Right to Life to organize college students in anticipation of the case that was going to the U.S. Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade. And after the Roe v. Wade decision, the national movement pulled together and then began the life marches in Washington, which 4 of our 5 children have participated in. But even back then, in the 70s, I was pro-death penalty. I thought of the death penalty as being a criminal justice issue. I did not think of it as a life issue. In the late 80s, a fellow named Tom Horkin, who was the first executive director of the Florida Catholic Conference and was just an incredible human being. Now, he was curmudgeonly. He was an Irish extraction lawyer. He could be, I don't want to say forceful, how about opinionated? But darn it, he got the job done. And he kind of browbeat me into doing the first amicus brief that the Florida bishops were going to do on a death penalty case. I still supported the death penalty. I didn't know a thing about it. I was a securities and tax lawyer. In the course of preparing that brief, which took 3 months, I became horrified as a lawyer, as a legal professional, at the horrendous rat trap that our death penalty is legally. I was horrified. I had assumed that anything so important as the government taking the life of its citizens must be practiced with a level of surgical precision that would dwarf even tax and securities law. I found out it was an absolute, arbitrary, haphazard mess that only picked the worst of the worst, it seemed, by accident, and had no ability to sort out culpability, even actual innocence. Many people don't know this, but there's no constitutional right to not be executed just because you're factually innocent. The Constitution protects procedures. If you've had all the procedures and you're factually innocent and your time is up, the courts can't look at the evidence of innocence. Who would have guessed? Who would have guessed? I sure didn't. So I was horrified as a professional at what the actual reality of our death penalty is. And of course I came back to Tom Horkin and, kind of discussed it and said, why hasn't the church told me about this? And he looked at me and he said, where have you been? And I found out that the bishops had started in 1980, formally. Many of them before that through their local organizations, but formally asking us to repeal and abandon the use of the death penalty in the United States. In fact, when they had the campaign in 2005, they didn't call it a new campaign, they called it a relaunching of the campaign that had been launched in 1980. I understand extremely well that there are different categories of concern when it comes to our life issues and the teaching of our church. There are the things that are called intrinsically evil: abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, assisted suicide. The reason they're called intrinsically evil, which is a $1.25 theological word, means you can never justify them, ever, under any circumstances, anytime, any place. Period. End of discussion. And the way lay people say that is the church says those are wrong. The death penalty is in a different category. What the church was telling me was it's a life issue. And because it involves taking human life, and because even those who have done horrendous wrong still maintain the image of God in their soul and on their human dignity, and that has to be respected, that we can only justify going to the point of taking their life when there are no non-lethal means that will protect society. And of course, in our first world society, we don't have to take life in order to protect society. We know how to keep society safe and to keep dangerous people in prison. It's called life in prison without parole. And in addition to the 405 death row cells in Rayford and Stark, there are 2,500 solitary confinement cells that are used if someone hasn't been able to figure out how to not be violent, even in a regular prison. This is where they come into a behavior modification program until they learn how to not be violent, even in prison. We know how to do it. We know how to do it so well that the risk of homicide inside prisons in the United States is lower. And that includes all staff and inmates. The risk is lower than the risk in open society. We know how to do it. We don't have to kill people to keep people safe, even in prison. So I found myself looking squarely, as I came to death row and as Susan came with me, at the teaching of our church, at my history with ProLife, and knowing that I needed to make sure that other people who never get the chance to be in the death house, you don't want the chance, who never get the chance to be with the families of the condemned, make sure they know what the reality is, because it never comes through the sound bites in the paper and on TV. All we get are the political slogans. And so that's why we make ourselves available to share these experiences. One of the most difficult executions I've been through, and that Susan has been through, was a man from the Panhandle with 3 daughters in their 20s. He was an Agent Orange Vietnam vet. And he said he was innocent. I gotta be honest, I take that with a grain of salt. I've been in prison ministry 25 years. I need more than just, I didn't do it. But in this case, the proof of his innocence was sitting in an evidence box in a Panhandle courthouse basement. And the local court had held it couldn't be looked at because the time period had passed. He was out of time. It went to the Florida Supreme Court, 6-1. Procedural bar, that's what it's called. Procedural bar is the modern legal term for when our representatives and judges do the Pontius Pilate thing and wash their hands and say, let his blood be on you. It's called procedural bar. There's a procedure that says the evidence is barred, it can't be looked at. The one dissenting vote, too much time has gone by. The one dissenting vote on the Florida Supreme Court of that case was a Catholic, Harry Ansted. I was very proud of him. And his dissent was powerful, and he said, this is unconscionable. Well, the morning of that man's execution, we were so concerned about his daughters who were saying goodbye to their father that the prison gave Susan permission to be there. Usually I'm there for the family goodbye, and she waits off site. But they gave permission for her to be there as well. And these daughters were absolutely devastated to the point where they were too traumatized to walk. One by one, as each of them said goodbye to their father, I had to peel them off their dad and carry them to the other side of the hall where Susan was waiting to try and help them. And then that evening, I watched him be killed by the state. And I knew this man's innocent. But of course, our own Supreme Court justices, Scalia and Thomas, have told us if you have the death penalty, you will execute innocent people. The only way to not execute innocent people is to not have the death penalty. I thought, boy, I don't think it can get much worse than this. And then just a month and a half later, 2 weeks before Christmas, 2006, it got worse. And I was the spiritual advisor to Angel Diaz and witnessed Florida's infamous botched lethal injection, where he was literally burned to death from the inside out with chemicals. And it took more than a half hour for him to writhe in agony and die. And I can tell you, if you have the death penalty, you will have botched executions, because human beings do the executions, and they make mistakes. Our church is asking us to take our tremendous tradition of ProLife and to step up on this issue, where even with those who have done grievous harm, we recognize the value and God-given dignity of their life. And even though it's on a different level of moral gravity than abortion and euthanasia, assisted suicide, embryonic stem cell research, those are on a different level of moral gravity. But the death penalty, the church is telling us, is a life issue. And they're asking us to take our tremendous tradition and history of pro-life and step up on the death penalty and to stop the practice of this unnecessary killing. If we had another couple of hours, we could tell you how it affects the staff. We could tell you more about the families of the condemned. We could tell you how it affects the families of the murder victims whose healing is put on ice for 10 or 20 or 30 years while they wait for this magic moment when supposedly they'll feel better when they watch a person be killed. And of course, that's not how it works. So there's a whole lot we could talk about, but the main point tonight is that we've been up close to Florida's death penalty for 17 years. And we can tell you, we don't want this done in our name. And our church is asking us to pray and to educate the people around us, so that they will understand that we need to put this in our past so that it's not a part of our future. Do you want to share?
I think one of the last things would be that when I watched all these families and their tremendous suffering, when St. Pope John Paul II had said that the death penalty in America was both cruel and unnecessary, I could see that every time there is another killing, that there is again another set of innocent people that are suffering. And these families that I've watched, that what they've gone through and the suffering they've gone through is also cruel, and it is unnecessary. So I think, again, that was one of the most powerful things that I've learned as I watched each of these innocent families who did nothing wrong just deal with such horrendous, horrendous grief when someone they cared about was killed.
So we thank you very much. We thank Father Tom for the opportunity to be here and share our experiences with you. And do we have any time for questions, or are we basta così? We're basta così. Okay. Thank you very much. God bless you all.